My presentation deals with the nature of translation in a multilingual context. Here, when I say multilingual context, I am dealing with our Indian context. I'm trying to highlight the uniqueness of translation activity in our context, and I'm also going to argue for reformulation of some of the concepts that are widely used in translation studies, because I feel that they are more applicable to monolingual Western context, but not to multilingual context like ours. I also discuss literary multilingualism and the issues that crop up in any translation of a literary text from an Indian language, Indian vernacular language into English. Traditionally, translation is always viewed in terms of binary divisions like the source language, source culture, target language, target culture. But with translation studies taking a leap into descriptive approaches from the earlier prescriptive ones, thanks to the invaluable contribution made by the two Israeli scholars, Aitamari Menjohar and Gideon Tori, translations came to be considered as facts of a target culture. Further, according to Tori, a translation will be any target language text which is presented or regarded as such within the target system itself on whatever grounds. Against this background, if we consider the multilingual context like the Indian context, where two or more languages present simultaneously in the society, translation as a practice needs to be viewed differently. Interlingual translation in this case doesn't become intercultural or international. Whatever the idealized categories in terms of binary divisions that we employ in Western theories of translation would be applicable only to monolingual context but not to our multilingual context. Though individuals can be monolingual in any multilingual society, there is greater interaction among the languages as they coexist within the same geographical, cultural, and social space. This facilitates translatability across the languages, and taking cue from the notion proposed by Emino, India as a linguistic area, 1956, scholars like Professor Uday Narayan Singh proposed the notion India as a translation area. Translation in our context becomes a necessary tool not only for internal communication but also to maintain peace and harmony within the nation. It becomes a part of our daily life as we need to switch the languages depending on who we are speaking to, and more importantly, illiterate bilingualism and multilingualism is quite common and in fact needed for the survival in vast majority of the cases. Given these realities, the question that comes to the fore is, what is the nature of translation when one is translating from one language into another within the same space? Let's try to answer this question. Contrary to what Tori claimed, translations become facts of the source language in this context, as there is no separation between the source context and the target context, as both source and target exist within the same space. Translations from one Indian language into another or even into English do not happen between geographically and culturally separated cultures. Rather, they happen within the source culture itself. And thus, as Maylaerts 2013 puts it, translations, both as a process and as a product, may also belong to the source culture. The context of production, circulation, and reception of the translation remain the same, and often the source readers and the target readers overlap to some extent. So this is perhaps the reason why in the Indian context, historically, we have rewritings, retellings, or free renderings of the classical texts and epics, not only from Sanskrit but also from one vernacular language into another. Unlike in the West, fidelity to the source was never considered important, and often no distinction is made between the source text and the target text, and the source writer and the translator. For instance, in Telugu, Nannaya, who translated the Mahabharata from Sanskrit into Telugu in the 11th century, was considered Adi Kavi, the first poet, and his translation, the Adi Kavya, the first Kavya in Telugu. This is the case even with other Dravidian languages. Self-translations or auto-translations that we find in Indian context could be another feature that is common to all multilingual societies. Now coming to literary multilingualism, it is typically characterized by three types of linguistic variation. The first and foremost is the intralingual language variation, which is of course quite common to any literary text, whether it originates in a monolingual or a multilingual context, in terms of different dialects, idiolects, sociolects, foreign accents, special stylistic forms, etc. that it showcases. The second one, intratextual language variation, which is the use of hybrid language involving code mixing and code switching, which reflects the social reality and resorted to by writers to achieve special effects. And finally, we have intratextual translation. This refers to any actual translation from some other language. The second one, the intratextual language variation, is of chief concern for us here, and its nature depends on the extent of the other language mixed in the primary language of the text. Sometimes we may find only words and sentences here and there, and other times we may find entire paragraphs. We may term it as heteroglossia following Bakhtin or heterolingualism by Rainer Gretman, 1998. What marks the literary multilingualism in the Indian context distinct from that of the monolingual context is that the embedded languages are not foreign languages in our case. They are the other Indian languages or English, which is also not a foreign language but one of the official languages of India. According to Anton Bauman, 1985, all great prose is rooted in the vernacular language and includes plurality of vernacular elements. He argues that every novelistic work is characterized by linguistic superimpositions, which may include dialects, sociolects, idiolects, or 2 or 3 different languages. It is this kind of superimposition of languages that is threatened by translation, as the translated text becomes completely homogeneous, resulting in the suppression of the deep vernacular roots of the source text and thus causes serious injury to the textuality of prose works. Another feature of the literary text originated in multilingual context, acknowledged by many scholars, is that apart from the overt translation mentioned above, there can be translation at a different level. Often the bilingual or multilingual writers think on one language and compose their text in another language. Here, the process of writing itself becomes a translation. According to Simon, not only the act of writing but also reading multilingual literary text involves a process of translation, as writing and translating overlap in a creative act, and she shows how the deviant forms of translation like translingual poetics, creative interference, and translation without an original would originate in bilingual and multilingual contexts. Simon spells out clearly the nature of translation in multilingual contexts. I quote, new forms of literary translation emerge within multilingual cultures from relations of proximity instead of distance, from contact instead of isolation. They create expanded definitions of literary translation as writing inspired by the encounter with other tongues, including the effects of creative interference, unquote. Though Simon expresses these views with reference to Montreal, they can be true of our Indian context as well. We can refer to even G.J.V. Prasad, his article, Writing Translation, The Strange Case of Indian English Novel, which is there in post-colonial translation, edited by Susan Bassnett and Harish Trivedi. This kind of translation present inherently within the text, not between the texts, challenges the traditional notion of interlingual translation. When writing itself becomes a translation, how can we distinguish between the two and consider them as two different processes, with writing considered a primary creative activity and a translation a secondary activity or a derivative? One could see that some of these taken for granted notions coming from the monolingual context, particularly the West, require to be revisited and revised. Yet another point related to literary multilingualism is highlighted by Maylaerts 2013. She opines that since multilingual literary texts often embody the larger tensions between codes of different literary value and prestige within a multilingual culture, the translation may highlight multilingual cultures' internal cleavages, their linguistic and identity conflicts. This remark by her prompts us think of self-translations made by some of the writers in the Indian context, where the question of identity comes to the fore. For instance, Harimohan Jha wrote his Kattar Kaka Tarang, a satirical novel in his mother tongue Maithili, and then translated it to himself into Hindi as Kattar Kaka. This won Sahitya Academy Award. Here, the question that immediately comes to our mind is why he did not write it in Hindi itself in the first instance. It becomes clear in this case that the writer identifies himself with Maithili literature and his work is an expression or assertion of his identity with his native language and literature. Thus, while he is writing this work in Maithili is an expression of his loyalty to his native language and literature, its translation in Hindi is intended to reach wider audience. Similar analysis can be extended to other Indian writers who would first write their literary works in their native language and then translate them into Hindi or English. Like we have Gurdev Singh, Jnanpith Award winner, who wrote first in Punjabi and then translated. We have Girish Karnad, etc. So this clearly shows different literary values or prestige attached to literatures written in different languages within a multilingual context. A kind of hierarchy among the languages can be perceived. The minority groups need to learn majority language, and this hierarchical relationship between minority languages and majority languages also leads to bilingualism and thus self-translation. Any literary production in a minority language offers its writers only a limited symbolic, social, and cultural capital. In addition, texts written in majority languages would have more visibility, wider reach, and more literary recognition and prestige. They also have more chance to get translated into other Indian languages. All these factors prompt bilingual writers to write in their native language and then rewrite the same in a majority language with wider reach. One more point to be considered here is the facility the writers would have if they are writing in their mother tongue. They can be more creative, competent in their mother tongue than in their other tongue. This makes them get due recognition as writers at home, which is actually needed before they get translated into other languages. It is often said that in the Indian context, the best literature is written in vernacular languages, not in English. So a point that goes without saying is thus that multilingual societies are ideal grounds for multilingual writers and self-translators. When the writer himself doubles up as a translator, there's no question of making a distinction between the authorship and translatorship, the former enjoying more prestige and recognition than the latter. So the different aspects that we have discussed now need to be acknowledged and addressed in translation studies. Translation studies needs to be enlarged, as Maria Tomosco argues, by making it more inclusive of the phenomena that get manifested in different multicultural and multilinguistic contexts. We may also note that the popularly used categories like domestication and foreignization, strictly speaking, cannot be applied in a multilingual context when the source language or source text and the target language or the target text coexist within the same space. Here, no importing or exporting across cultures or geographical locations is taking place. So, in Indian context, translation of literature has been viewed as another factor related to translations in the Indian context is that translation of literature is viewed as a unifying force, bringing unity among diversity across languages, literatures, and people in general. It is considered a tool for national integration, facilitating greater understanding among people belonging to different languages, cultures, and historical traditions. In short, it is considered the lifeline for unity of the country. This is in fact the motto of CIIL Academy, India's National Academy of Letters, which commissions translations of literary texts from one Indian language into another, particularly of the literary works that bagged the CIIL Academy Award. Now, let me discuss two literary texts selected for this study and their translations. These are, one is Kanya Sulkam. I'll come to the examples later. So, Kanya Sulkam, written by Gurujad Apparao, and its English translation by C. Vijayashree and Vijay Kumar. So, a brief note about Kanya Sulkam. It is a social play written by Gurujad Apparao, published in 1897 in British India. In terms of the language employed, the text is unique in the sense that it implies mixed linguistic codes, different dialects, and also different stylistic variations reflecting class, caste, and gender distinctions. The play is written in colloquial Telugu, but a lot of English is mixed in Telugu. The text also has some quotations from Sanskrit and a couple of Urdu words as well. Of course, it is quite common even in contemporary literary text to find this kind of hybridity where English is liberally mixed in the native language. But now the question is, how does one to treat the hybridity present in the source text in terms of mixed languages while translating them into English? what is the aesthetic and ideological function of this heterolingualism? How can it be pursued in the translation? Following Jimbert and Patrick Jabal-Besk, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correct or not, we can refer to any other language found either in the source text or the target text as a third language, L3. If we consider L1, in this case Kanyasulkam, L1 as Telugu and its translation into English is L2, the English language component present in the Telugu text can be considered as L3 source language. So in its English translation, this L3 source language along with L1 becomes L2. It means the intermixing of languages gets lost in the translation as both L2 and L3 become the same. This is what happens when the target language and the language intermixed in the source text are the same. So the important factor to be examined here is whether the effect of this intratextual language variation is carried on to the target text or not. What happens when a heterolingual text becomes homolingual? It's common knowledge that the different dialects, sociolects, or stylistic variations based on factors like caste, gender, level of education, etc., cannot be preserved in any English translation of a literary text from an Indian language, and thus the intralingual language variation gets suppressed in the translation. The English translation made by Vijay Sri and Vijay Kumar, it was published in the year 2002 by the Book Review Literary Test. The translators have retained the English words present in the English words and sentences present in the source text, and they have added a note. they put these English words that are already there in the source between inverted commas and mention the same in their foreword. The Urdu words have been retained and the meaning is given in the glossary. Here in this particular drama, one main character, Girisham, is an English educated with half knowledge of many subjects because he misquotes many lines from English poems in his speech. So he tries to give an impression that he is learned and modern in his thinking. So the writer thus puts a lot of English words and sentences in Girisham's mouth. Right? So the heterolingual text with generous doses of English deliberately mixed in a Telugu text for a purpose, for a reason, becomes monolingual in the translation. So the hybridity is totally lost in the translation. But is there anything that a translator can do if the text is being translated into English and then if there are a lot of English itself in the source, except mentioning it in the foreword or the translator's note? Besides this intratextual language variation, the rich intralingual variation present in the text also gets erased totally in this case. The text is in fact showcases different stylistic variations.
For some time. Hello.
Oh, I'm okay. So, so the other one is a novel by Pandita Parameshwar Sastri Vilnama that's translated into English by Uma and Sridhar, Uma Ladi and M. Sridhar. So a different problem surfaces in the second novel. That is, as you can see that caricature, Pandita Parameshwar Sastri Vilnama, in this one, the intratextual language variation is of a different kind. Here, while all other characters in the novel speak Vyavaharik or conversational Telugu, this person, Pandit Parameshwar Sastri, being a traditional Brahmin, speaks Grandic Sanskrit Telugu even in his day-to-day life. So, the coexistence of highly stylized and ornate Grandic Sanskritized Telugu and the conversational Telugu, you can consider it as heteroglossia or diglossia. Now, the question is, how do you retain this kind of variation when you are translating the text into English? So it could not be. The translators have mentioned it. How does one get across this linguistic variation in English? This I'm quoting them. We have made some effort in terms of the choice of words Sastri uses, but we have left the stylization and the unique and Grandic style of speaking to the imagination of our readers. So anyway, I'm coming to the concluding remarks. So as far as the practice of translation is concerned, like two things I'm looking at. One, as far as the practice of concerned, and the other one is theory. So as far as the practice of translation is concerned, we may note that multilingual contexts give rise to multilingual or plurilingual literary texts. And when these translated into English, invariably they become homogeneous, etc. The translators and translation study scholars need to be conscious of this major transformation the source texts undergo when they get translated in English. Second one is, in terms of theory, there is a need to recognize the realities obtained in multilingual contexts that are unique and accommodate them in the mainstream translation theories. The Eurocentric focus of the earlier theories need to be revisited and expanded to make them more inclusive of different multilingual and multicultural contexts. Since the number of scholars working in the field of translation studies in the Indian context has been growing rapidly alongside the practical translators, it's time for our Indian scholars to formulate our own theories that would reflect the practical realities and contribute to the Indian turn, quote and unquote, in translation studies. This requires, first and foremost, apart from other things, a need to bring the practical translators and theoreticians together in mutual understanding and more mutual respect. The gap between the two needs to be bridged, and the false notions each have towards the other are to be dispelled. All of them have to unitedly strive to strengthen the research in the field, make it more vibrant and visible, and participate more actively in international forums to usher in an Indian turn in translation studies. Thank you.
Thank you. I was thinking about this multilingual context that we usually have in our classroom, and I was thinking how some of the interventions that you were talking in your lecture can be applied there in the classroom as a pedagogy, as an alternative pedagogy. Because in the university that I teach here in Banaras in the university, we actually, in a usual classroom, we have students speaking at least 7-8 languages. So I was thinking, like, as a pedagogical tool, like if we give them this assignment that utilizing the multilingual context and giving this assignment to them that they can translate, for example, a small extract. And so I'm very much interested as to how we can potentially develop this multilingual context through translation as a possible pedagogical tool for our classrooms. So, although your paper was not addressing that, but do you have some thoughts on that? Just curious.
Actually, Umesh, earlier, in all language teaching classrooms, we have grammar translation method, right? Mm-hmm. Even when we were studying in government schools, we used to have it. They would give sentences in isolation, 5 or 6, and ask us to translate them into English or something. Mm-hmm. Okay, so of course, after that, it lost its potential, and we have moved on to communicative teaching and etc. etc. We don't. Maybe you also don't allow them to speak in any other language if it is an English classroom.
Right.
But then I think in some contexts, again, this grammar translation method is coming back in a big way, it seems. Mm-hmm. Well, why can't we use it? I mean, especially if you are in a rural area, if your institution is in a rural area, people are maybe first generation literates, etc. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of advantage in using their mother tongue or the other tongue that they are familiar with in teaching a new language. Mm-hmm. Could save a lot on that, and you could easily connect it. And then when it comes to English, basically in India, they're afraid of English. In some rural areas, English, everybody fails in English, and they have some kind of phobia. Mm-hmm. But they can overcome that if you can use their mother tongue and then bring them back to the English classroom.
Right.
Okay. So multilingual context, see, naturally, I did mention about illiterate bilingualism and multilingualism. I have a maid living here who she doesn't know, she never went to any school, but she speaks 4 languages. Mm-hmm. So, and then automatically she changes the language depending on who she is speaking to. Mm-hmm. How naturally it comes. Mm-hmm. With great difficulty we are learning another language, but this lady and her kids also are like that. Mm-hmm. Marathi, Kannada, Telugu, Hindi they speak. Mm-hmm. Right? Yes. So, something that has to come naturally, maybe in the classroom, pedagogically, like if you can expose them to different languages and then give them exercise from and into.
Right.
Provided the teacher knows these languages.
Yeah. Actually, my worry is that nowadays, even the young teachers are actually asked to teach grammar through interactive methods. So it's like
Huh.
interactive grammar and so forth, as we are highlighting. So
Hmm.
unfortunately, this classic method, as we are talking about, which used to be the mode
Huh.
earlier,
Yeah.
has taken a backseat. So I mean,
Yes.
yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. Actual language you have to speak like, see, even I don't subscribe. You see, we cannot teach a language through grammar. You don't have
Mm-hmm.
to know the grammar to know the language. All
Right.
of us, we only know English grammar, but we don't know the grammar of our languages.
Right.
We
Right.
never learned it that way. In a natural setting, natural setup, we acquired, as she was saying, we acquired that language. We didn't learn it formally. See, so we should not insist on grammar, learning the grammatical rules and all, testing on grammar, etc. But see, this is how textbooks are there. CBSE textbooks are like that, NCERT textbooks are like situational teaching. It's only a context.
Okay.
Okay, but
Adit-
always for translation studies teachers, this is the problem. Like you see, if you give a piece of text in English and ask them to translate into their mother tongue, if you have a mixed group, each one will translate into his or her mother tongue.
Right. Right.
So we won't be able to evaluate all of them and guide them properly.
Right.
So we need the help of other teachers. At least in IFLU, we can take the help of other teachers who know that language. We go to them with the script and ask them how the translation is. So
Yeah. So Aditya is actually asking a question, I think to you.
uh, Aditya Kumar. Oh, yeah, CIIL. Okay. So multilingualism from Indian perspective, there are many varieties like English, Tamil, Kannada, etc. are coming up. So how do we start here for some standard parameters? Actually, I have Aditya, I have skipped some sections from my paper, fully written paper. So there I was talking about the translation, the variety of the English language that we use when we translate an Indian literary text into English. Invariably, it is our own standard. See, it is the translator's language. So if I'm from a Telugu background or Kannada background, I have my own variety of English, or more or less, I think we subscribe to some standards in terms of maybe general Indian English. Okay, earlier we used to study general Indian English. Okay, rather than going into English, Tamil English, Kannada English, etc. See, those who venture to translate a text from a vernacular in English, we would expect them to know enough English in order to translate that text. Okay, so only when it comes to, I think, these varieties you are talking, they come to the fore, or they become prominent when we are speaking. These become more like accents. If I speak, you know that maybe our mother tongue is Telugu, and if you speak, I know that his mother tongue is Hindi. But when we write it, that may not be there, it may not get reflected. See, all of us use the standard English or Indian general Indian English or something. Only when we speak, all these accents become very clear. Especially in some contexts, Variya speaker, Bangla speaker, you can easily make out. So, is that what you are asking, Aditya? If you are there, you can speak.
No, he is not there anymore.
But how can we say standard parameters? What are who sets these standards? See, we say as long as it is understood by the intended readers, intended audience, then it's fine. Okay, it should be acceptable, comprehensible. Oh, he is there. Some of these varieties are also being used in books and other written platforms. Yeah, maybe, yeah. But then, do you use them, Aditya, in standard English textbooks? Uh, for short stories, yes, creatively in literature, you can wherever there is conversation, even in a novel or a short story, you can use these varieties. They closely reflect the mother tongue of the characters. But when it comes to English, translating into English, you see, I think all of you, Umesh and even Tariq, when there is a dialect in the source or different dialectal variation, different characters speak in different dialects or socialects in their regional, maybe Telugu novel, for instance, and if somebody translates like Uma or Sridhar or Vijayashri, when they translate it to English, they don't venture to use one of these native English dialects like Cockney English or Scottish English. No. So sometimes some translators did experiment with wrong spelling, wrong grammar, but then publishers would correct it. They would think that no, you went wrong. We are not supposed to experiment with such things. Of course, I mean, each dialect or socialect has its own associations, connotations, and we cannot find an equivalent socialect or dialect for anything in any other language. Okay, so this is a problem. It remains forever, and there are no solutions. Translators only acknowledge that okay, the original is written in such and such a dialect, and it cannot be translated. They only acknowledge it. They only talk about the kind of variety, the language that is used in the source. But when it comes to English translation, we have several problems. On the other hand, if you're translating into your mother tongue from English or any other language, maybe to some extent you can use different dialects, or educated, uneducated, or if there are any gender distinctions or Brahmin, non-Brahmin variety, we can use when we are translating into our mother tongue, but not when you are translating into English. Odia translation of Bangla novels, which are full of the mixed varieties, and gradually these are affecting the standard forms. So maybe if the publishers come forward and the translator is willing to experiment and publishers come forward, people can do that. Yeah, but then Aditya, I think one more thing is in the Indian context, when we talk about the English translations, they also act as indirect translation, intermediate translation that facilitate translations into other languages. Take it as an intermediary translation that helps in translating in the text into other Indian language, because we don't find efficient translators who could translate from one Indian language, and for instance Rajasthani into Telugu, I may not find anybody, so they would translate invariably from an English translation. So if the English translation is a standard, written in the standard language, it can easily be translated into any of the Indian or other languages. In fact, CIIL Academy is doing that. It gets all those novels or works from different Indian languages which bag the CIIL Academy Award get translated into English, and then when they commissioned the translation, once they asked me to translate a Punjabi novel, and then I said I don't know Punjabi. No, we will supply you the English translation also, madam. They said so. So I was thinking, see, in the Indian context, we can go for more and more collaborative translations to avoid indirect translations, because the internet makes it possible now. I can collaborate with Umesh and we could together translate something directly. So more and more collaborative translations are being done now. They will be more authentic than indirect translations.